Hello and welcome to Unwatchables, where the films are mad, sad, and sometimes bad as hell, and we're not going to take it anymore. I am Marc Dottavio.
I'm Seth Troyer.
And today we welcome author B.R. Yeager to help us discuss two films that share more than just a cinematographer. The theme today is Teens in Trouble, and both of these movies show the dark side of coming-of-age stories in all its potential trauma and violence, though only one offers any glimmer of hope. The films are Larry Clark's 2001 true crime story, Bully, and Gregg Araki's 2004 sex abuse drama, Mysterious Skin.
The kids still aren't all right. They still aren't all right.
Yes, kids are not all right. Part 2.
I know.
Our guest, B.R. Yeager, is a fantastic author whose work includes Pearl Death, Amygdalatropolis, the widely loved and acclaimed Negative Space, and the new short story collection, Burn You the Fuck Alive, which definitely wins the best title award for anything on this podcast. But Seth, I know you are a especially big fan.
I am. I got into Apocalypse Party, which published Negative Space, BR's big novel that I really loved. I got into that through M. Kitchell. I started reading M. Kitchell off him. I don't know if you're familiar with that guy, BR.
I've read some of their shorter pieces. I know has been published through some really
stuff.
cool publishers. I have not dived into
I just saw
book-length
the
works.
logo on the book, and I was like, "What is this?" It looks like a metal band logo or something. And it is Apocalypse Party is this kind of great. I've already kind of repped it on the podcast. Talked about it with Christopher Norris, who did our Lindsay Lohan episode with us, which was great. But yeah, it's like this sort of like, I don't know. It feels like it almost grows out of zine culture or something, of this like punk DIY. It at least has that feel to it. It's definitely more established than something like that, but it has that feel of like, it is not like the New York Times book review or something. It is like it's a lot of experimental weirdo authors, and it does have like kind of a bent with music, it feels like, in some regard, or like horror, heavy metal. And I know that music plays a lot into your books and things, but yeah, I eventually found Negative Space, and I'm holding it up on the YouTube version of this podcast. This is why you should watch it on YouTube. How exciting to watch a podcast on YouTube. You're welcome. But it is a beautiful book, and it's really, really, really fucking haunting. And I don't know. I feel like I could go into the plot synopsis of Negative Space, but I might leave that up to you. But I'll at least finish introducing you by saying, like, this is like one of the best horror novels I've ever read. It wasn't just like, oh, this weirdo like publishing house I found. It's like, I feel like you should be like the Stephen King for millennial Gen Z punk kids, right? Like, it has that feel for me. Like, I feel like, I don't know, you're the real genuine article with horror and also creating real characters that are meaningful, and there's something deeper beneath it than just like the intense darkness and like sort of sci-fi elements. There's something truly that gets to like things like depression and suicide in like a real life sort of way. I was really impressed by it. So yeah, I don't know if you want to go into things about Negative Space or your new book, things like that. It's just the deal.
Well, shit. Thank you so much. That's extremely kind, and I appreciate that. Yeah, you never know when you're like working on it. I mean, it's like that cliche thing, but like, it's like you never know whether it's gonna convey the things that you're intending to, blah blah blah. Um, but yeah, I feel like that was like, we don't need to linger too much on sort of my stuff, but it's it's appropriate that we are dealing with these two filmmakers because they were definitely very formative in my early influences or works that I encountered that deal with like a lot of similar topics, misspent youth, etc. Terrible decisions. Um, but yeah, it was kind of yeah, yeah, no, just very like less these particular films, but certainly Nowhere and The Doom Generation and Kids by those filmmakers were really big. I was a close friend of mine from way back. He was really into kids, and he introduced me to Tulsa, which I still think is Larry Clark's masterwork. I'm not sure if either of you have read through or looked through Tulsa, his Larry Clark's, I think, I want to say 1971 or at least early 70s photo book.
I can
Still
see
think
that. I
that's
mean, that is like
probably
the
his
closest to
masterpiece.
what it seems like he's actually obsessed with,
But
which is his
yeah, no,
whatever is going on in the 90s. He's seeing it being linked to his past, right? Which is with these sort of dilapidated houses he's living in with drug dealers and drug
right.
addicts and prostitutes and things like that. And he's just photographing them, and he's one of them, right? And it's this sort of, it is gross and depressive on one level, but it's also this sort of expression of freedom and like love and things like that for him.
Yeah. And we did do an episode before on Larry Clark where we
Absolutely.
talked about Kids and
Sorry.
Ken Park. So we've dived into him a little bit in the past, and we were kind of hard on him on the initial episode as far as his shortcomings as a filmmaker. I think bringing up Tulsa is really important because that's a really good context for where he's coming from. And I've seen many pictures from it. I've not looked through the entire book, but he is a very gifted photographer. And of course, that was something that he, like you said, he did in the 70s. So by the time he burst onto the scene with Kids, his very first movie, I mean, this is a guy in his 50s, basically. And so there's a lot, as far as the criticisms of his work that people could read into, as far as him perhaps trying to recapture his own youth, which I know ran into a lot of difficulties with, drug abuse and all kinds of things. So it's easy to psychoanalyze him, I think, especially since his movies are so much of a piece with each other. So where are you coming from, I guess, with, Kids and him in general? Like, have you followed his career much past that initial flash in the pan?
A little bit, like in a very incomplete way. I should note that my very good friend I was talking about is Justin Davis Jacobs, who was like the co-writer for the story Highway Wars in that's in the collection Burn You the Fuck Alive, and he's someone who's been one of my best friends for the past like 30 years at this point. And it's important to note that he's originally not living now, but he's originally from Westfield, which is Westfield, Massachusetts, where the band Folk Implosion, who composed the score for Kids, is from. So that was kind of a really big deal, like a hometown connection for him. But he was like really, I'd seen Kids previously, like when I was like 14 or 15, when it had, I think, first come out on video. And from there, after like meeting, I wasn't really aware of him as a creator, a photographer, filmmaker, until my friend Justin turned me on to Tulsa. And then later on, I had seen Bully, and I've also seen What's Up Rockers, which I have not revisited since then, but I remember not having the kindest response to it. I'm not sure
I've
how I
heard
would feel
unkind
about revisiting
things,
it.
but
Because
yeah,
this
that I
was,
mean, on the
maybe
subject of
15
youth,
or
which
so
was
years
like at the
ago.
center of this conversation, like with both of these movies,
Yeah,
I think it is pertinent that we had you on this episode as much as you are a horror writer, like billed as you are at least in negative space dealing with teenagers and who are dealing with like really intense, like whether it's supernatural or not, there's really intense situations with like especially suicide and things like that. And there's also, it seems like you are also in negative space having this relationship with your teenage years. I can only imagine like you are looking back in a way, which I think is sort of both like what is interesting about Araki and Larry Clark and what can be, I imagine, their biggest challenge and maybe yours in negative space, which is this sort of like you are you are not a teenager anymore. So the door is closed. You only have your memories. So you're both like, it's like this insider outsider sort of situation occurring, right? Which is where there's like dissonance sometimes, especially with like Larry Clark comes under fire for that
absolutely.
by lingering on a 16-year-old girl's body and things like that. But even Iraqi, it could be argued, is, just it's so difficult to figure out how to be responsible, and also like maybe I'm just being out of touch. Maybe I don't even know what it's like, what teenagers will think of this.
Mm, mm. Well, yeah, it is interesting and something that I think about a lot of, writing about present day teenagers while pulling from like lived experience from a while of like you're transposing, um, experiences from one generation onto a different one and, trying to see where those commonalities are. One thing I thought was interesting, we can get into it like more later on, was I could be completely wrong, but something that really struck me about Bully was that there seemed to be a lot of anachronistic slang, which like I don't like. I feel like I was a teenager. It may also be a regional thing. I feel like I was a teenager um, at the same time as the kids portrayed in Bully, and like they're like I've never heard anyone like seriously like refer to a guy as a hunk like in a sincere way, or remember that as like a teenager. I know, or like referring to scoring dope. I don't like, no one I know like referred to like buying weed as scoring dope, even though that was like of like the 60s or 70s. I think Michael Pitt says that this is a weird scene, which again,
That's
there's like,
so
I feel like
funny. I
these
didn't
like
even
little
think
bits
about
of
that.
anachronistic slang and like part of potentially Larry Clark
They say
experiences.
that so many
I had
times.
never heard like dogging out the
No,
5.0.
dog
I had
out the
never heard
5.0.
anyone
She
like
says it like
get
five different times in like
so many
three
times.
different scenes.
Well, what's interesting is that, Kids
I
has
thought
a
we were going to dog it
screenplay
out. It's a
by a
5.0, yeah.
19-year-old Harmony Korine, and there's even more of a kind of documentary feel of that, where you can see that they did stick pretty closely to an actual script, but you get the sense that there were still contributions maybe from the real kids who were hanging around. Where Bully, it
Right.
had a professional screenwriter as well as more polished professional actors in it as well, so it loses a little bit of that docu-realism feel, even though he works hard to try and recreate that. But also, I mean, the story behind the making of this movie is that they did have a script from the screenwriter David McKenna, who wrote like American History X and Blow, and you won't see his name on this movie because he disowned it when he saw the final product. And from what I
Right.
gathered, Larry Clark didn't use a lot of his script and went more directly back to the book that this was based on, which was about a case that happened in 1993. So I wonder if maybe him going directly from the book And maybe he got some of the slang from that from
Right.
circa 93 as opposed to the movie that came out in 2001, that there was a
Right.
disjunction there. And but just for anyone who doesn't know, this is based on a true crime, the murder of Bobby Kent, which happened in Florida in 1993. There was a true crime book about it called Bully, a true story of high school revenge. And
It's gotta be Florida. There's no other place that this kind of thing would happen. These, oh my god!
And they filmed in Florida, so there's a pungent Florida atmosphere here.
Oh,
and
it's the green hell.
Like apparently they filmed like in the area where it actually happened. And the point about supposedly, like using like a lot of the actual locations, and shit like that. Going back to just what you were saying about the how he was throwing out the script throughout, I looked at this, I read that up after I watched it, but it definitely made a lot of things make sense, like why the dialogue's super rough.
So basically this was after he did Kids. I mean, this had a lot of similarities to it, that, you know, Kids came out in 95. It, like, you know, got an NC-17, so they released it unrated. The same thing happened with Bully, and except it never played in more than like 20 theaters apparently, because of that. But it's interesting that, you know, in Kids there were a lot of non-actors or unknown actors, but it did introduce people to Chloe Sevigny and Rosario Dawson. And now in this movie we have, you know, Brad Renfro and Michael Pitt, who I totally forgot was in this movie until putting it in again. And
he's the lovable acid kid with the crazy eyes.
Yes, it's so crazy to see. Like I didn't realize that actually, what's his name from Mad Men, Vincent Kartheiser, who plays Pete Campbell on Mad Men. He came from a Larry Clark movie. He was in Another Day in Paradise, it's called, that he did like right after Kids. And so I feel like him, Michael Pitt, you know, Nick Stahl, I don't know, they should be in some support group of like, I was a teenage Larry Clark twink.
How am I doing?
Yeah. And it's crazy to see all of them in this, but you know, Larry Clark to me seems to be like a guy who very much wants to be part of this scene and hang out with these kids like behind the scenes. And so you have this blurring where you have professional actors, but you also have really troubled actual, you know, drug addicts or people like Justin Pierce from Kids, who died very young from suicide, and then Brad Renfro, of course, from this movie, and who died of an overdose. And he has this way of surrounding himself like, with genuinely troubled people, and you have to wonder sometimes how, you know, is that just the nature of it, or how responsible was he maybe with these people? I don't know.
I listened to a podcast it's like the Bret Easton Ellis podcast where Larry Clark was on there. So boy, getting those two together, wow, it's like a tornado. Wild room to be in.
Yeah.
What a couple
it's a wild interview.
Because Larry goes into this whole
I've
thing
only heard pieces,
about
but that's wild.
like,
it's wild, yeah.
Brad Renfro, and it's like a characteristic of Larry's whole, like, he's doing both. Like, he's both giving these kids like something to do, but he's also, the thing that they're doing is based off of the things that they shouldn't be doing. Like, he went and found Brad Renfro, who is like starting to become established. Like, he was just like living with his grandparents, like in a trailer, and somebody told him, you should be in a movie, basically, and was starting his career and everything, but he was like a heroin like addict or cocaine addict. I'm not sure which one at this point.
Right.
But when Larry came to pick him up in like Knoxville, he was apparently, according to Larry, like bleeding and like overdosing, and it was his birthday, and he like forced him into a car and like essentially, like, it sounds like he kidnapped him and like made him go cold turkey off like the drugs he was on. And it's just like all these things where it's like he is kind of it's like he's helping and enabling at the same time. It's a wild little interview. He also goes into this, he like describes his style as like, we did every single shot you could do, anyone has ever done in a movie. We did it in Bully. We did every single shot anyone who has ever done. We put it in bully. I don't even know what
Right,
that
right,
means, Larry. But
right. Yeah, yeah. I
they do
didn't
spin in a
particularly
circle, and it
notice
makes
it
me
while
really
watching
sick.
it. So,
Oh
Yeah,
my
that's the
but you know,
showiest
maybe that's
shot
success.
probably
And
is
Like I
is
literally
that
had to
spinning
look
around.
away. Like
that, yeah. Apparently that was to save time. They like there was a storm coming on, and him and the DP were just like, I think we can get everything that we need to convey if I just like spin around and try to hit
it's
them as much as
surprising though.
possible.
You're like,
And
wow,
that's
they
one
are
reason why
remembering their
came out
lines
so rough.
for like they do cut like 4 or 5
That's what I had
times
read.
while
Yeah,
they spin in a circle, but yeah.
yeah,
Well, let's start with the cast then, because there's
yeah.
a lot of things that I think don't work, and then things that I think do work in this movie. But I think Brad Renfro. I mean, it's always sad to watch something like this with someone who seems so authentic in this role. I really thought he did a great job, and I was impressed with pretty much everybody. Really, there's big people like. Well, how about this first? Because we have Nick Stahl, who was another person whose career
Yeah.
was almost completely destroyed by drugs. He disappeared for a long time, but I believe he's doing okay now. And it's kind of
Terminator 3,
strange.
you know?
Yeah, he was in Terminator 3. He got to be John Connor right before. Not a good precedent for John Connors. I know that Edward Furlong had some troubles with drugs and stuff too. So maybe that's a cursed role or something. But
It's Skynet. It's not their fault.
yeah, but Nick Stahl is the bully in this. So we have 7 teenagers who decide that they're going to kill this guy, basically because he's just such a pain in the ass or kind of a bully, even though he's part of their friend group. And it's kind
I
of weird,
mean,
isn't it,
he
that Brad
beats up on them
Renfro?
for sure, but
Yeah, but Brad Renfro is this kind of big, bulky guy, and Nick Stahl's kind of this little pick sweep. So I know some people think that the roles should have been switched, or that physically it doesn't really make sense. So I guess I'm
well, I think
interested
that's
in that.
part. Yeah, that's part of what's going on. I think I don't know if it was there in reality or what, but I know that there is some sort of like gay tension going on that's at least trying to be like inferred or pursued in these, because they also talk about how Bobby Kent and Brad Renfro's character, I think it's Marty or something is his
Marty,
name.
yeah.
Yeah, they would do like schemes and stuff. They would film guys like masturbating and sell them and stuff, like sell VHSs of these things and stuff. And there is like this implication that I think Larry is trying to get at, and like also the guy who wrote the book is trying to get at, that maybe there was something. Yeah, like right, like why would this big guy like put up with this little guy? Maybe there is something here that's like romantic, or even
Except
beyond that.
in real life, the bully was a giant bodybuilder guy. So that
Yeah.
was something that they changed for the movie. And I don't know if maybe that's just because, Larry Clark really likes to get, smooth, skinny young guys in his movies. I don't know if there really was more of a thought to it than that.
True.
I think I read somewhere about him having an intention around it, of that, Brad Renfro has like a physique and a look that is more kind of could lend itself to a more stereotypical bully, whereas Nick Stahl is not. So I think there may have been an attempt to try to play with that a little bit, or like play with those expectations. I'm not entirely sure. I think it works really well. I think that it gives it a really compelling dynamic. I think all the performances are really great, but I think that they like particularly have like a really interesting and honest seeming chemistry.
Yes.
And the fact that Nick Stahl is Bobby, correct? Yeah. The fact that it is more of a 3-dimensional performance than you could easily go with it, where he is like showing remorse when Marty's pulling away. or like it's not like a real remorse, but like how do I like kind of lead this person on and everything, or how do I continue to have this person in my life? Because I think the way that's played is that there is this like actual love for Marty, that seems to be like there, but buried underneath all of this, you know, toxic, abusive inclination, which, you know, I think that they hint on, you know, part of repression, part of, you know, maybe upbringing. The movie kind of slots into a lot of the movies of the time, like American Psycho, where it's about, in terms of like skewering the American dream a bit, and like the Bobby's relationship with his father, of, you know, hey, you have to live your life a certain way, you have to, you know, follow the rules and kind of be, worship discipline to a certain extent, if you want to make it a certain way, and that kind of gets kind of warped and twisted by the way that
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
interesting
he
that the bully
interacts
is the
with
one
and
who is headed
has
to
a
college and
relationship
has
with
this
Marty,
pressure
if that
from
makes
his
sense.
dad, and all of these other teenagers, including his best friend, are high school dropouts.
Right.
But that almost seems unrelated to how sadistic that he is. You know, he rapes one of the characters, and besides all of the abuse that he is pouring on to Marty, that there's all kinds of things that are hinted at in there that are going on that I'm not sure it fully explores, and maybe part of that is because he was sticking so closely to the book. From what I could tell, the real case is like very close to almost everything that we see here. Like he just wanted to include everything. And you know, there are all these different dynamics between these people, which you could say
Yeah.
Marty's girlfriend seems to be kind of the mastermind instigator behind this, who's pregnant with Marty's child and doesn't want to let him go. She's played by Rachel Miner, who I think is also really good in this.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Yeah,
there's
she
different
just gets
people
this
like,
fucking cold face through the whole thing at a certain
yeah,
Absolutely.
point where she just
Absolutely.
it's you believe that, you know, she has things to be really mad at this person for. Like obviously, like he has raped her and he is abusing her boyfriend and everything. She almost though goes into this like it almost if and not in a way that quite the opposite. Like I use the word possessed and it sounds supernatural, but like quite the opposite. It feels like kind of maybe how this kid maybe became like obsessed, right? She's like suddenly it's beyond just like wanting justice. It's like this obsession
Mm.
with this idea like I could kill some. What if we killed somebody? What if we did that? What if I had somebody in my life that I could make them disappear because they hurt me, right? It's like this idea that is just she's like manic about it by the end of the movie.
and we also have another guy I totally forgot was in this movie. I guess his name
Yeah,
is Daniel
absolutely, 100%.
Franzese or something. He's like the cousin of one of the characters who just kind of gets roped into it, and you
Yeah.
do get kind of a sense that he has his own motivation of wanting to be around the cool kids because he's not as you know, sexy as and cool as everybody else. And this is the guy who
Mhm.
most people might know him from Mean Girls. He's like the Lindsay Lohan's like sassy gay friend, and I was like,
Man,
oh
that's
my
right.
god,
I
that's
forgot
Damien
about
from Mean
that.
Girls. Yeah. I forgot
Oh,
that he
whoa.
was in this. So, and I think that their personalities kind of
That's
become
awesome. I didn't
clear the
realize that.
closer we get to the actual crime, because you know we have Michael Pitt hanging around who doesn't even meet this guy that they're planning on killing until the night that they do it, and he's just this kind of showboating silly stoner guy. And if you don't think that maybe he's that well drawn at first, I think it is fascinating that as soon as they get to the immediate, you know, planning and that murder itself and the aftermath, seeing how they all change is very interesting. But I do want to talk. I kind of want to separate the first hour before we actually get to the
Mm.
murder, because that's where most of my problems are with this. And I think that the big thing with Larry Clark you have to figure out is what degree is this a trenchant sociological, study and insight versus kind of being alarmist and scaremongering, which is also another thing that also versus how much of this is him trying to titillate us or himself. Because I really think he can't get out of his own way sometimes, that there is so much of these kids walking around completely naked in the first part of this movie, whether they're having crazy over the top, like kinky sex, pouring hot wax on each other, or they're just hanging around at home, or Nick Stahl is just naked in his bathroom when his dad starts to give him this heart to heart talk. But all of these unmotivated shots, even if there's nothing else going on, of their asses and crotches, and shirtless underage extras, just classic Larry Clark stuff that's all over kids. It's all over Ken Park and all of his movies. And so I guess I would like to hear what you guys, how distracting that stuff is to you, or if you think there is a motivation there that is justifiable. Because to me, so much of it seems like it's not even representing anybody's perspective in particular, except Larry Clark's own. Like, why, when we just have her getting her nails done, talking on the phone, do we get this big close-up of her crotch, Can he just not help himself, or am I being too hard on him?
Yeah. I mean, I guess that shot in particular was the one that felt like most distracting to me, I guess, in terms of it's like, where it was like, come on, Larry, man, like, come on. I get like, otherwise, I guess I felt just kind of caught up in the drift of it, which I tend to really like. And I think that actually, Larry Clark excels at more so than more kind of strict typical narrative stuff of just kind of like everyone hanging out and like driving to a different place and like, okay, they're here, they're hanging out here now, and now they're hanging out here. I really enjoy that for the most part, and didn't really find, especially compared to like some of Larry Clark's other stuff, it felt actually like less voyeuristic to me than like, or I didn't really like sense like a particularly like voyeuristic like feel to it, aside from the nail salon shot, of course. So yeah, I think I like that. I may have ended up actually like liking the first
I guess
half
this
of it,
is
like,
always the discussion,
half,
especially in 2023 about a Larry Clark movie. It always goes back to his responsibility or lack of responsibility to these teenage actors, these young people that he's working with. And it is this sort of, I don't know, like I go back to his interview with Bret Easton Ellis that I was listening to, and his whole thing that he keeps on bringing up is like the truth. I'm like obsessed with the truth. I want the truth, and like that's like he always says like is his major motivation for like why kids happened and why Tulsa happened and all this stuff. He wants to see things that he's not allowed to see, and like that still goes in both ways, where like the truth is like that he is indulging sleazy desires that he thinks are just truthful in a way. I think at certain points, I think this movie has more style going on, which helps it. Like some of the like sensuous nature of the movie kind of works for me because it feels like it's more of like a capital M movie than kids. Like it's less of that voyeuristic feel because it has more like editing going on and more kind of, I don't know, like movie lighting maybe helps. Every single shot anyone's ever thought of, he'd put it in this movie.
It has every
so
single shot
going
that you
and
could
going
possibly
and going.
do.
But yeah, that is
There's
kind of
every
the
single
flip
shot.
side to everything, that it is like, I don't know, the young form has always been viewed as this like aesthetic point of beauty since the Greeks or whatever, and he's just being an artist, he could say. But it's pretty, he definitely is a man indulging some of his yucks here. I do think it's, I don't know. I go round and round, and I think it's like built up to make you go round and round and kind of just basically feel unsatisfied. At least for me, feel unsatisfied with any which way I fling it, right? Because it still is like, don't necessarily, it's not great that we have these like images of 16-year-old girls being naked, but it like in my face, but it also is this like, it is this exciting like sexual kind of thing going on in this movie, and it is the world that these teenagers are living in. Yeah, I think, yeah, it's hard. Yeah, it's a hard place to land, but I do think he's a little bit of a sleazy kind of guy.
Oh, sure, certainly. Yeah, I think what I was saying more was it's not that it isn't there, but like it didn't seem as pronounced, or at least to me. It may have
No.
just been, or I might just be desensitized to a lot of shit too. Um, but it seemed like there
Well, it's
was
definitely
like
not as graphic as something like Ken Park, and
yeah, no, it's tricky. Yeah.
there is more going on here, I think, thematically than in a movie like Kids, which really, it does seem to me to be a lot of just, oh my God, look what they're all up to, and the depravity is coming from all corners, like the entire time. And this one does a better job, I think, of focusing in on something specific about the group dynamic and how that changes ways that they might not behave otherwise. But maybe it would have made more sense the way it's shot if it was more from the perspective of the dorky cousin character, because then it would make a little more sense about um, emphasizing how sexy and cool everybody looks. That it would make sense from a POV from his character for all that stuff to be emphasized as it is. But for me, I think more often, I know the
Remake.
original screenwriter like didn't put in all of the stuff with like the gay club and them making the homemade gay porn tape, which all comes from the actual case. And it's kind of funny that, of course, Larry Clark was like, no. We not only do we need all this stuff, like I'm gonna like really like put as much, emphasize it as much as I can. And I'm not sure he really makes sense of it that much or explores it quite enough for me, that it sometimes ends up feeling a little more like a shock tactic. Like there's this
The
really weird
sexuality, you
moment.
mean?
Yeah. There's this really weird moment where Brad Renfro is having sex with his girlfriend or somebody, and Nick Stahl runs in and like throws the girl off of him and says something like, "Oh, it's my turn," or "I'm next," almost like he's going to have sex with Brad Renfro. I don't know. There's this really abrupt dissolve that happens right afterwards, and I was always left wondering, like, what is going on here?
No, he has sex with Rachel, right? And that's when the rape happens.
Well,
right.
Another element.
Okay, I know
Important
that she
element.
had
Right.
had sex with
And
her.
that's why we
I know the
don't
way
know
that the
whose
dissolve is
child
so
it is
quick there
or that,
and
yeah.
moves on to the next scene.
Yeah.
It's like something mysterious is happening. Because we do get a longer, more drawn out actual rape scene with Bijou Phillips afterwards. And yeah, I'm just not sure I think he's maybe a little reckless with throwing as much of that stuff in as he possibly can, without totally making sense of it in a meaningful way. But maybe also it's hard for me to separate Larry Clark, the personality of the guy, I guess, from when I'm seeing this stuff happen in his movies. So maybe I'm not being totally fair about that.
Personally, yeah, I personally found that to be like, I do wish that there was like explored a little bit more. It may also just be a matter of there like not being like, if you're pulling like so, or if you're like so chained to like the book, it might involve like the amount of like content or like accounts that are actually there. That was like, though, that aspect I think was like the most interesting part, that like really like I think complicates again the relationships there, and like what the, not to say that like any aspect of like Bobby's behavior is like justified or in a certain way, but like in terms of like, and not explaining necessarily, but like being a piece of this portrait of repression that's happening in in this like small Florida suburb. I think it's a small Florida suburb. And yeah, just like that, I just thought that was it was like a piece of like a very interesting, like to me, a really compelling, like portrait of a dynamic between the two of them, and like how, like, even if it wasn't like fully explored, or even if it wasn't, it didn't like really go to, if there wasn't like a conclusion from there or anything, I still think that was like a very like compelling and necessary like aspect of kind of illustrating like it being not just a matter of like, here's like this like piece of shit who's a piece of shit to people, who is being a piece of shit for like necessarily like no reason, or hasn't, or that's the extent of his relationship with other people, that it's not, again, like going back to sort of those moments when Nick Stahl would kind of like break down when Marty seemed to be had enough of his shit and was leaving, when he would kind of like break down and like kind of be begging for him to stick around, and like, got kind of like lovey-dovey and everything. That's like, that's not necessarily something that you would expect, and like hints at like a much more complicated dynamic than just sort of a surface level of like, this guy is like a cruel asshole.
Yeah,
like he's a cruel asshole.
that is definitely something we touched. It's something we touched on when we talked about Kids and Ken Park, is that there's the experience of watching these when you're the same relative age as the kids, right? In these stories, and then there's you watching these like age 20 and beyond, right? And then you suddenly are like, well, yeah, I mean, these kids are doing bad things to each other, but the emphasis is on the word like kids. They are suddenly like in your eyes. That is like the weird moment when you watch something like Bully, and you're like, no, they're like, yes, Nick Stahl's character is being a bully, and he is kind of being a monster, and they all are like kind of being monsters in their own way that leads to this murder and everything. But yeah, it kind of is like it adds this layer of complication of the whole thing of placing, like, sometimes I wonder if Larry's like, if he's always being as empathetic as he could be or not, like if he is like being like kind of condemning this one over this one, which really the whole thing is like, isn't it sad that kids can get this mixed up and get this like fucking into their own heads that they do these terrible things to each other, right? Which, yeah, it's like I don't know, you're never excusing them, and not at all. They still have to be responsible for their actions, but there's, yeah, I don't know, it's this interesting aspect of this that is like, yeah, they're kids, they're fucking up, they're just like fucking up.
Well, I think you've hit on something there, because all of the kids are, to a certain extent, not the sharpest tools in the box. They all are kind of assholes. I mean, Marty, pretty much beats up his like girlfriend when she tries to tell him that she's pregnant. And there's there are things about her character that seem very Machiavellian and disingenuous at times. And you have Michael Pitt, who's just this hedonistic guy who just thinks the idea of killing someone is just a cool way to posture and seem like a tough guy. And you've got,
and he's the
Leo
first one to put the blade in.
Yeah, you got Telly from Kids, who's still hanging out with shirtless young boys, smoking and drinking, who's pretending to be a hitman, and even the guy who seems like a dork doesn't have much of a personality, and is everybody to some extent I guess there's one way that you could excuse it and say, well, these are unformed people, these are kids, and look at that as empathetic or an insight. And then on the other hand, it's, well, you could reduce this story to, well, you get a bunch of vapid, shallow, like sex obsessed idiots together, and you might get they might commit a horrible crime.
Seems like that's what happened, for real.
Right.
I think that's what happened, actually. I think that's the mystery solved.
I like the idea of that. Like one, I love just how stupid the plan was, and how like stupid all of the decisions after, sort of when they realized like, oh, we fucked up. We like left tire tracks and a fucking knife sheath. And then the fact that everyone spills the beans like immediately right after. It's like, I like that, there's this, piece of like Americana and like American mythology of like the sort of the genius murderers, or like, it's like, oh, these are the people who like have these children conspired to commit this murder. And it's like they did, but they were fucking idiots, and they did it in the stupidest way possible. And I love that. I love kind of the demystifying of it, of that it like it isn't necessarily these just kind of like genius, or just like like soulless monsters or something. It's like they're just fucking dumb kids who did it. And there's like no romanticization around that or anything.
Not really. Yeah. Again, that's another aspect that I just go around and round about, and I think it's because Larry's vision isn't totally like airtight and like from day to day. Like his thesis is sort of changing probably, because I don't know. Yeah, it is a
For sure.
complicated thing. He's trying to do a lot of things, which one is sort of demystifying and showing you that these kids are just like kind of vapid and stupid. On the other hand, he is making a movie about them and putting sexy like actors in the roles, and they do kind of feel like rock stars at certain points, especially if you're kind of a young viewer watching this. They seem kind of cool, right? And at certain points, especially in the beginning of the movie, they're like, man, they're having all the sex and all the drugs they could ever want, and they're so cool, and Michael Pitt's so hot and everything, so it is kind of this. I don't know, do you guys feel like he is sometimes, I don't know, either, I think at the end of the day, I still question like his impulse to make this movie. I think it is a fascinating idea for a movie, and it's like obviously like you are sucked in, and is like juicy gossip going on here. But I sometimes worry that maybe I don't know, is he being too mean to these kids, or should he be meaner to the kids even, because they are murderers and they are kind of terrible. But again, they are kids, right? And I don't know, they're all like, a good chunk of them are still in prison as we speak right now. Marty was given the death penalty, which is wild to me.
Right.
But ultimately, like, was just given life imprisonment. But yeah, and then there's this movie about them that is made to like show the world how badly they planned and how like fucked up they were and stuff. So
and
I don't know.
No one's as pretty as Michael Pitt in real life.
Nobody. But yeah, how do you guys feel about that? I don't know.
Oh, I'm not sure. Like intention, I mean, like intention is one thing, and then like the film itself, like the product of that intention, is like a different thing. And like, I don't know what any intentions are, and movies are made by a lot of people, all with their own intentions and their own ideas going. And obviously Larry Clark has his ideas, the actors have their ideas, the cinematographer, etc. So it's like I can only kind of judge it from like the final product of it coming out, and like I find it very compelling. That's kind of all I can judge, like I in terms of like responsibility, or like outside of interpersonal responsibility. Like I mean, I saw kids when I was like 14 or 15, and like I don't think that it necessarily had an influence on sort of, not that I didn't like do stupid shit, and I still did stupid shit, and I still like did drugs and stuff like that. I don't think any of it was necessarily because of kids. But that might be the case for other people. I'm not really sure, but yeah, I don't know. I think that the main issues that I have for it is I think that the dialogue is super rough, and that the actors really like they perform past the lines that they're given. Because that's another interesting thing of it. If he's pulling just quotes from the book, you're pulling quotations of what people are probably saying to police or saying to interviewers and things. So it's like not even like direct quotes or anything, like secondhand things. You just get a rough fucking script out of that if you're doing it line by line and not like finessing it a little bit. But I think that all of the actors are performing past it. I think that going sometimes like hewing so closely to like the true crime aspect of it, I think that the part when right after they do the murder, they go to a different location, they go to that beach, and then they realize they have to go back. I think that could have been finessed some more. Like those are the big things that kind of like stuck out for me.
Right, it wouldn't kill you to cut that out.
Right, certainly. Like in terms of like sort of like it's hard for me to like judge on aspects of like sort of aspects of like the gaze that is happening or like responsibility or anything because I can really only comment on like my own relationship to it essentially, and it's just tricky that way.
That's kind of the same issue that I had when we talked about the film Compliance, which
Right, okay.
it like meticulously recreates basically exactly according to the facts how this crime that seems unimaginable ended up happening with seemingly normal people, and it does that very well as far as putting you in there. But there's always the question of, okay, did we just get a good documentation of exactly how this happened, or did it go any further into, in an artistic way?
Right.
And I do think that's something he doesn't really have a grasp on here, that they're really, this was a horrific crime, but was there really, import to it as far as drawing something from it or diagnosing something? And so much of it is just relying on their dumbness and just being the kind of kids who would get wrapped up in this, whereas there's probably more kids who are capable of being young and idiots and not killing people.
Right.
And there's not really anything in the movie that's representing an effort to romanticize them that the movie is pushing back against. So for me, the best things that came out of it were just from the filmmaking perspective, and it's mainly around the actual murder itself, which I do think is maybe Larry Clark's best work just as a director. The intercutting between the two cars as they are driving up to do it, the way that we've seen Michael Pitt showing off and playing the tough guy this whole time, and then as soon as he's asked a simple question by Bobby, like, why are you here? He just gapes at him and can't even think of anything to say.
It's a legitimate laugh out of me because they were coaching him the whole time because he's just on acid the entire movie. So they're just coaching him with his lines of like, and also it seems like it doesn't even matter. Like what they're really paranoid about is like, he's going to ask him why Donnie's here and Donnie's going to have to say something about it. It's like, who cares? It's going to be fine. Like,
but he can't even come up with words to say. He just like stares into space. And the way that even when they're on their way there and they spend all this time talking about killing this guy, they're still look at each other and saying, so what, do you think we're just going to beat him up? Or just wait, is this really going to happen? And when they actually get there, I mean, I was really feeling the tension and the chaos start to spin out where they really have no plan. And even when they try to have a simple signal and tell this girl, just walk over and then yell to us, hey, are there any alligators? And then we'll know that we can come over. And instead she walks over and she starts quietly asking the guy they're going to kill, hey, are there any alligators here?
They can't hear her.
Yeah.
And as soon as the killing starts, like half of them just end up retreating and cowering in a car right away while it's happening. And the stuff, those details like that were very compelling to me, even if they didn't necessarily add up to anything greater. I was just like, all of a sudden I was suddenly absorbed and drawn into this and feeling that queasy kind of feeling of things getting out of control. And then of course you were talking about afterwards, they're no one wants to take responsibility for
Yeah.
it. Sometimes they're joking about it. Sometimes they're like, well, I wouldn't even say we murdered him because he was fighting back. And then they're immediately telling anyone in earshot, whether they're bragging about it or they're confessing because they're nervous about
stabbed
it.
him 3 times.
Right.
Right away, she's like, "Hey, mom, so like, can you report a crime without saying who you are, like a murder?" And that stuff was compelling to me. And when everything does, the downward spiral happens so fast. It's like just the last 10 minutes of the movie, everything just immediately goes to shit.
Yeah.
And there's this like Fatboy Slim song that's playing on the soundtrack as they're all being like arrested, and I was kind of like, that was the first time it was really working for me. Yeah, I actually like that. But then again, then it just kind of ends and we get the little post credits or pre credits, just this guy served this many years, this guy got life in prison, this guy got life in prison, and that just made me kind of land on, oh, he didn't really have an end game in mind for this. He's just like, all right, here's their sentences.
Yeah,
let's move on. So the whole thing is this push pull
totally
for me of like there's a actual something powerful in there that's like trying to get out, and I would get glimpses of it throughout.
Well,
and
sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh no. Well, like the crazy thing that I like read about was that he was originally given like 40 days to shoot, and then at the last minute they were like, actually no, you got 24. So it was like that made me, I think, appreciate
with these non-actors and
more.
everything.
I think that made me like appreciate the movie like a lot more, and like forgive like a lot of the things that I was kind of like, oh, that's a little bit rough there. Just knowing it's like, okay, like having been involved in a couple of like, they're not at that scale or anything at much less of a scale, but like of just kind of like, okay, just gotta get through it. We got like, we have half the time to like go through this. That kind of gave me like some perspective in terms of like, okay, that's probably why certain things aren't necessarily like connecting, or like why, maybe like certain, you went with that take, like some of those moments and such.
Right.
It's probably the take they had. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Sounds like he was working with people who had never acted before too. It's kind of just, that's the best we could do. Like, if anything, we were impressed by that one, or like we did a bunch of camera techniques so that we didn't even really linger on that.
Right.
It was just hokey of her to do that. Right.
Well, I'd like to get everybody's final thoughts here. First of all, where this does rank in the Larry Clark canon for you, because I know Seth and I were kind of going into this with the thesis that maybe this was his best film, that where things came together more than the other ones. And I'm interested to hear if anybody does think that, or where you would set this alongside Kids or anything else that you've seen. And of course, if you would unwatch it, if you could, which is always a question that we ask, although usually seems pretty obvious by the time we get to this point. So, well, Seth, why don't you start us out?
I mean, I think this one, it does surprise me that, I guess it doesn't surprise me. That's the thing, because I always go back to what makes Larry so amazing is his visual eye, and I think it comes from being a photographer and him bringing that to movies. It just seems like a seamless transition, and not just that he is like, oh, he's like setting up a beautiful shot. He has such a sense of momentum and movement, and I think as much as he is like kind of this docu filmmaker kind of guy in Kids, it's kind of great to see him make a movie with Bully. And like what you said about the actual killing scene, the murder scene, and like the way it's all shot and edited and everything, like, I don't know, like it almost makes it seem like he might actually be kind of great in a kind of just a dumb thriller movie as like a director. Because he can really make you tense, like regardless of how shocking or controversial, like set that aside, like just the sheer, from a filmmaking perspective, he can really push it. And I think it's kind of impressive. I do think this is probably his best movie, I think Kids is always going to be like his most interesting and his most like, you just got to contend with it. You got to, as like a, I don't know, some kind of social talking point. And I do think there's some beautiful photography in there. If, you know, some of it is of horrible, cringy things. It's, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I would say this is his best movie. I wouldn't unwatch it at all. I think I'm, if anything, I'm very impressed by some of the performances he got in here. Because yeah, I like what BR was saying. Like, you are like, you know, I've only been a part of small movies too, and you are just getting what you can get at a certain point. And it's sometimes it is like just kind of wild what you can make with what little you have. They got that with these, and I think Brad Renfro is such a loss in hindsight, because I think he was like headed for something really great. Because here, even in this one, like, he's, it's all about him just not saying anything and like holding his head down. But we all know that kid, the like big tough kid who just doesn't want to talk to anybody, and he doesn't want to like express himself, and he just nails Marty's character so well, and he's such a good center for the movie here. So yeah, I think it's impressive if it is kind of, yeah, like we said, messy and tricky like the entire time we were talking about this movie. And I think it's warranted. Like, it winds up being kind of a mess, but like an interesting mess.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to forever be a big Larry Clark skeptic. And I think a lot of his movies depend on the strength of like how talented the people around him are when he gets a cast that's able to bring something more to it, whether it's Chloe Sevigny in Kids or Brad Renfro here. And but I do think the cast can only pick up so much slack. And the best thing that I could say about Bully, which I do like slightly more than like Kids or Ken Park, and it's mainly because of that glimpse that I get of Larry Clark, however brief it is, of someone who can get out of his own way for a second and make something that is really striking and effective and even provocative. So you definitely can't say this movie doesn't press buttons and make you have a visceral impact in a way that maybe a more uh, whitewashed, for lack of a better word, like kind of flattened out version of this story might have been. Um, so yeah, I would say that I need to see more of his movies, I guess, to definitively say it's his best, but it's the one that has parts in it that work better for me than any part of the other films that we've talked about. But also, you know, it's been over 20 years since. I'm kind of ready to shut the book on Larry Clark in general. I'm not sure his real masterpiece is suddenly going to show up one day at this point. But BR, so what is anything final you want to say we didn't get to with this, and where you would rank this movie?
Oh, I mean, my last little note is that that as you know, a white boy who grew up in like the '90s in the suburbs and everything, I really appreciated that Cypress Hill conversation that they had in the car on the way to the murder.
Oh yeah.
That rang very, very true. Just so inarticulate, but just that just felt very, very real. Um, so
Everybody lit up at the same time, and he's like, "Yeah, I lit up too. Yeah."
God, it's so fucking real. Jesus. Um, but so in terms of like ranking it again, I haven't seen like all of his films. I still think that I would rank Kids above this one just because I feel that that caters to his strengths as more of like having um a naturalistic vision in terms of a more documentarian style. It just seems to fit more with where his strengths are. And I just I like the drift of it. I think that he like really does well with like just not showing not a lot happening and just showing people interacting with each other, and that's all that that movie is. I said this would probably be like a very close second though. Again, found a lot like very compelling about it. Again, a lot on the strength of the performances. I just think that like really everyone, like all of the actors, were very compelling and just knocked it out.
Yeah, anyone who can survive Larry Clark can tend to go on to good things.
Yep.
Or
But
more
not
Larry
everyone
Clark
does.
movies.
Yeah.
Like like that one guy who's the quote unquote hitman in this movie.
Leo
He's just like,
Fitzpatrick, Telly. Yeah.
you think this is a game? This is killing people.
I definitely went to high school with a guy who was like he had his own little like suburban gang and stuff like that, and would
Oh,
like they all had like stick and point tattoos, but you know it was
Every gang has their own hitman, self-proclaimed hitman.
right. It was very much again that was also a great moment when at the very end when they're like what but we thought that he was this like when they're finding out that he was all bluster. That's all, and they're talking to his dad, who's Larry Clark in it. Yeah.
Oh my God, that was him.
Yeah. I
yes.
had to look
Which?
at it. Like, fuck, is that Larry Clark? That makes so
Oh
much
yeah.
sense? Yeah. But yeah, I
Oh,
wouldn't
wow.
unwatch this one, but yeah.
All right. Well, let's move on to a filmmaker who is a little more giving and generous
Oh
with
yeah.
his
Yeah. This
characters and to
conversation
the
will be a
audience.
lot easier.
Certainly.
This will be a lot lighter. Yeah. Let's relax with Mysterious Skin.
Definitely
Yeah.
a degree of compassion that's much more evident.
Yes.
In his, even like not so much this film, but even when he is portraying, because I just rewatched Nowhere recently too. It's like even though he's like portraying everyone as kind of like a doof, there's like still a lot of heart there, and like it's it's not just as they aren't like as flat of a characterization as like a lot of people would be doing with like those types of Gen X kind of like, oh yeah, kind of characters or whatever.
Yeah. Well, Gregg Araki it feels less of like a geek show kind of thing. Like, can you believe these people? He's more like, yeah, we're like he's one of them, and it feels more empathetic, and that they are both fucked up, but also I'm showing you that they are just kind of beautiful people as well, like very caring people as well, right?
Well, and
I
his
just watched.
movies have a sense of humor. Like
Yes.
there's an element of fun and silliness that Larry Clark would not go near with a 10-foot pole, and I think that defines his early movies. Gregg Araki's definitely, which I just watched a couple for the first time, The Living End and The Doom Generation, to kind of get a sense of them, and they are these very brazen, like anarchic kind of dark comedies. They have a lot of disaffected Gen X attitude to them, but there is a playfulness, and of course they are usually associated with this new queer cinema or queer new wave because they tend to have like gay characters in them, and so you could kind of put him along with what a lot of independent filmmakers were doing in the early 90s, like Todd Haynes or Gus Van Sant with My Own Private Idaho, or Derek Jarman. Like they weren't like message pictures about being gay. It's not Philadelphia or something like that. They just are queer characters where everybody wasn't defined by heterosexuality, and they're all very different. And he just has, I feel like a lot of his movies, Mysterious Skin accepted, are more about like fun and playfulness.
Absolutely. Oh, for sure. I think even I haven't really watched his films after Mysterious Skin, but even then, it seems like they tend to be much more like surreal and playful. Um, Theatrical is something I realized with watching this movie. Like I felt like it it was the first time I realized like, oh, this could be like a stage play almost. And I was kind of
Oh, for sure.
I was applying that a little bit to his previous things, and there is like an aspect of like kind of like almost theater acting. Until that's a through line throughout his films, which I hadn't realized before, but I think is interesting.
Yeah, like James Duval in his like 3 teenage apocalypse movies that include the Doom Generation. He's sort of got this like kind of, I don't know, you wouldn't call it, it's like faux Shakespearean almost, in the way like he'll just pontificate about life is so whatever, but it's also beautiful, man. And he's like this beautiful, like kind of ditzy loser. And it almost seems like there's a through line to Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character in this movie, Neil, who has this sort of dazed, beautiful, like broken angel thing about him, and he can kind of go off on those kind of tangents, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, and I the only movie I've seen after this is Kaboom from 2010, which like is a very silly, surreal, like absurdist comedy that I like a lot.
It's back to his early stuff, yeah.
Yeah, and I know he's done a couple other things like Smiley Face, which I haven't seen, but I get a feeling is at the very least like a silly comedy.
It's like a stoner comedy, right? I think that's what I heard.
I think
Anna
it's
Faris.
super underrated. It's like a Big Lebowski light or something. It's kind of hilarious.
Nice.
Yeah, but so the point is that Mysterious Skin, especially when it first came out in 2004, was like viewed as this just major leap in maturity and sensitivity, which
and
could have
budget
been there
for him. That's
things.
the thing. Yeah, this is like his his early work is like first and foremost like art house with campy sets and campy characters in another sort of heightened reality world, right?
Absolutely.
Like more borderline John Waters, but here he is working with Scott Himes' novel of the same name, which is based in the real world, and he takes it in a realistic way. He still brings his Araki sort of dreamy, kind of surreal touch to it. Like the soundtrack is a big part of all his movies.
Oh my God, yeah.
That is huge in this, where it's Robin Guthrie, the guitarist from Cocteau Twins,
right,
and Harold Budd doing the soundtrack, which just, if anything, listen to it as just images and sound. Like it is a wonderful ambient experience, if anything.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it was so Araki was like another person who was like really big when I was a teenager. Like I had gotten the unrated Doom Generation on VHS because like one of like the movie gallery was like closing out, and like we were me and my friends would watch that so many times on like just staying over at like a place or anything. And so we were like following his career, and when Mysterious Skin came out, my friend had gone to see it first, and like the thing that we were always like talking about was like, oh, he like made like a real movie now, like that's not fair to his like previous stuff. But we were like very, very shocked by that he had something like this in him.
Yeah, that's what, especially going straight to this from watching his early movies for the first time.
Yeah.
It doesn't even really superficially resemble them.
Yeah.
And it's so in tune emotionally with everything, every character and everything that's going on. And it would have been probably just as revelatory at the time to see Joseph Gordon-Levitt playing this role, because I'm pretty sure most people would just know him as the kid from Third Rock from the Sun by the time this came out.
Right.
He had just done a movie called Manic, where it was like a drama where he's in a mental institution that not a lot of people saw a few years before. But this, I think, just blew everybody away and led to him doing stuff like Brick, and then becoming the actor that he is today. And before I even get to his performance, because the opening scenes of this movie are fucking incredible.
Yeah.
Like I was absolutely gobsmacked, and I saw this movie a long time ago, but the way that this starts out depicting these two little boys and how they are, groomed and raped by this older man, but the way that he depicts this has to be like the most daring depiction of the just conflicted feelings that would come from actually experiencing that, where he's
like
actually
nothing you've ever seen in movies.
Really incredible, like really unbelievable. Like from the staging to like the writing, the staging, having all of the shots like head on, which I later found out was kind of partially a practical choice, but I think they're incredibly effective artistically, because you really especially with the baseball coach like staring right on and like talking to the audience as if you were the child. Unbelievable, like incredibly upset, harrowing, and like affecting. Um, to just like you were saying, the writing about the conflictedness of it, of that, that there can be that sort of attraction there, but like, or feeling, having like positive feelings around it, but while also having these experiences of being violated. It's like a lot of complexity that wasn't being like dealt with in a lot of, especially this was like a fairly mainstream feature too. No, just really impressive and really affecting.
Yeah, it shows all of this happen in a completely subjective space within the mind of the kid in a way that, I mean, almost feels dangerous. Like
Yeah,
he's
Yes.
capturing the wonder and the mystery of childhood and the beauty of feeling like you're loved and special. And it's like this kid at the same time is like he's experiencing his own sexual awakening and even some attraction while he is being groomed and molested by this guy.
yeah,
And a
Yeah, they're
lot of
filmed like romantic scenes. That's the thing.
right.
Like they are filmed with a romantic air, with this like whooshy like keyboard music. It is like a lot to handle and does feel like, yeah, you're watching something that is kind of dangerous, but is, I don't know, ultimately, like, yeah, that is the thing about this. It is about how Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character Neil has this really complicated, but like obviously something that occurs in real life, that he has this complicated relationship to his abuser,
Yeah,
in which he maybe on an intellectual level, like as he gets older, he can intellectualize that, yeah, that was fucked up, and I thought one thing and he was doing another thing, and now I understand it. But like he was, as a child, like in love with his coach, in like in a, and I do use that word, like I think
yeah,
it is romantic by the end of this movie, that he is, and he still is, like it's his first love and he still seems haunted by it, and it affects his sexual relationships, like what he seeks out in his relationships, but he is like owning it in this sort of way that is like, again, like it's hard to even like talk about with, yeah, like, and like let alone like approach it. Like I can't imagine as a filmmaker trying to do this in the right way, where you're not trying to pitch to the audience that like, hey, it's all right that this happened or something. Like it must be such a difficult tightrope to walk.
Yeah, it relies on, us as viewers to know that obviously this guy is a monster
yeah,
who is doing this. And that's something that a lot of film Twitter idiots would be upset isn't spelled out for them. Like it prizes your intelligence to understand what's going on and know and be able to see that while still being put in the shoes of this character who, frankly, I don't think a movie today could get away with showing, who's actually clings to this as a fond memory and kind of raises this coach up to be this mythological figure from his childhood.
right.
And you can see outside of that how it's ricocheted to this guy who is kind of just becomes defined as a lust object for other people, and him filling his emotional spaces that way. And it's such risky, tricky territory to go in, and the movie is just so bold and forthright about diving right into it. um
And how that impacts how he engages with others, and like a really lazy version of this is that he becomes a molester as well. But you see, I think a really great scene is that moment when he's at work being the announcer at like the local baseball games, and there's that kid who catches the ball, comes up and gets his prize, and you see him treating the kid in a similar way as that the person who groomed him had been, but never goes anywhere further than that, or it doesn't even apply that like this guy's going to try to groom other children or molest them. That's not his type. That's not what he's like looking for or anything. But still, that experience and the way that he was treated and the way that he was groomed and romanced by that guy is impacting the way that he is interacting with like children and other people. Um, so I think like that's like, again, like just talking about the, tricky lines to walk with that. Like it would have been really easy to be like, oh, well, this guy was abused, so he's going to turn out to be an abuser too, because like we all know that's not how it all happens. Um, but still to kind of like illustrate that and like it gives you pause when you see that happening, but like it doesn't like play that up in an unnecessary way, or it doesn't go for like a shock or going like all the way into the most abject possibility.
Yeah, when kids are good, you have to reward them.
You're right.
What he says. That's like what he learned from this. And you see him himself when he's still a kid doing what kids would do, where he acts it out on another kid because he thinks that's a normal way to interact because he was trained that way.
Right.
And he even kind of helps introduce other victims,
Right.
At that point, which is, that's a very complicated kind of shame that a lot of real victims have to grapple with. That is not a comfortable place to go or to talk about. And especially when you're talking about somebody who really does have this romantic, feeling or believing that this was an equitable and beautiful relationship. And he does, I would say that he never really challenges that.
Right.
Throughout. This isn't like a normal journey of him discovering, oh, this was bad. Like,
right.
There's no easy answer at the end of this.
Right.
Yeah, no, we leave basically, not to go into the ending necessarily, but we leave with him basically, yeah, it goes on. This is not the end for him, of his ideas and how he's working through this. I don't think he'll ever get over this, and I think that's true to trauma in general. But I think, I don't know, that it's wonderful how Gregg does emphasize what I think is real in Scott Heim's book of the movie. That is, that I think as much as it's trying to communicate difficult things and trauma and abuse and everything, I think what it communicates about that is, for a survivor, and probably the most like frustrating thing for a survivor to communicate, is that like, this is one thing that happened in my life. And like, in a way, like this event is still the center of the movie and it's where everything flows from, but there is a lot more to this movie, right? It is one aspect of it, which it is still, like, I think on another level, just a movie about growing up.
Yeah.
And like finding hard truths and transforming and like finding yourself and stuff, even
finding
like,
your
beyond
friends.
that, which
yeah,
which he does find a sort of like, in the end they do meet. There is like a parallel narrative going on with the Brian character, who was also molested by the coach, and he internalizes it in an interesting way that does kind of get Araki's surrealist eye going, which is he tries to, for, how whatever's going on in his mind, we're not sure how it all works, but it's layers of denial, where he is interpreting it as he wasn't molested, he was abducted by aliens.
Right.
Which we get all these like wonderful UFO shots and stuff and weird lights and all that. It's just kind of great.
Yeah, and we definitely should mention that. I mean, there's a whole parallel half of this movie that's about a different character who never even meets Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character until the final scene, and who, we come to learn also had been molested, but he literally has blocked the memory out and thinks he was abducted by aliens. And I do think that's a really interesting approach also, although I definitely didn't like that part as much as the other half of the movie. And I think that it might just be the way that they're juxtaposed, that I don't know, even the way that there's constantly these fade outs and dissolves like all throughout the movie that almost does make it feel like the two parts were just pasted together. And my main criticism was that there was this kind of choppy, halting rhythm to the whole movie that sometimes would kind of pull me out of scenes when they would abruptly go from one to the other. And maybe it's also just that the stories are so different, where this one is this really sober, harrowing reckoning with this guy's life and how it's proceeded since then, and the other one is kind of a holding pattern for most of the movie, where we know what the truth is, that he was molested, and we don't it's just him not knowing it until the final scene. So and giving them equal screen time, I guess, was the main thing. Like I was so affected by the Gordon Levitt half of this and his performance, and frankly I was a wreck during like so much of this movie. And so it almost like doesn't matter that it wasn't as powerful on the other half of it, or that I'm not sure the stories complemented each other. But when they do meet up, it's pretty powerful. So yeah, I don't know. What did you guys think about that?
Certainly. I like that part quite a the his name is Brian, his half of it. Particularly when he started hanging out with, was it Eric, the friend of the of Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character,
Yeah.
who stayed behind,
Right.
and kind of seeing just some of that like development from there. That was just, I don't know, I just really liked seeing the two of them interact and seeing him open up a little bit. But yeah, no, I could see how that. I mean, like a lot of the Gordon Levitt narrative is just like so
I have a hard
compelling
time
and
saying
so
that
driving.
name too.
Yeah, no, I have a hard time.
Neil,
saying
his name's
everything.
Neil.
His name's Neil.
We can just yeah.
Right.
It's tough.
I'm not sure if any of the going back and forth like threw me off very much. I think I found the Brian portions compelling just because it was, again, getting in another way of how this person was kind of sort of dealing with that experience. And like it was, even though that we knew where it was going ultimately, I just thought it was like a very good performance. Again, carried by performance. And yeah, I'm not sure what else there. Not a lot to say there. You can cut that if you want.
Oh no. I mean, I'm right there with you in that, and I can't tell if maybe just because I've watched this movie a lot, I do. It is one of my favorites, as much as it is a difficult movie to handle, and maybe it's because I read the book too that goes into more with the Brian aspect. But what is communicated with me is with that is like, at first it does seem like one is greater than the other as far as like, why would I keep returning to this Brian kid? But I do think it is, I don't know, what's deeper there feels like the analysis of truth versus denial, and how they're both like, just, they both have their kind of dangers. Like, as much as denial is billed as like this thing you shouldn't do, in a way he seems safe, and like, and it's, again, it's like not the right thing for him. There should be a balance between these two characters that is ideally found. But Neil accepting all the truth that is there kind of is terrifying. That truth that he is in love with his abuser, and like that truth, if you let that in, sometimes can kind of fuck you up, and like kind of messes with his life in a way that makes it hard for him to move on, right? Well, even if it is like the truthful thing and the real thing.
Well, it's interesting. Like Neil, even though he knows what happened, he's like, he like talks about that he knows what happened. He only his friend that he stays in New York with, she's the only person that he says he's told her everything. So it's still, they're both, he's still holding on to it and keeping it as a secret, and not, not to go into therapy talk or anything, but like he's not like working through it, or like done work to address it or the impact
That's
that it's
true.
had on him, even though he's fully aware that happened and he understands how it's informing his types, etc. um he's still not fully like acknowledging or addressing. He's still kind of keeping it at arm's length. um so it's kind of more kind of like one person who's willfully doing that and one who, you know, his own mind did that to him.
Well, yeah, and in a way, he is in denial that it was abuse and that
Yeah.
it wasn't this perfectly loving thing. And maybe that, he is kind of represented as this emotional black hole he's described as by his friend, that he, when he does have to actually get intimate or vulnerable with someone, it makes him very uncomfortable. And he kind of has it mixed up where he's seeing this memory as something he wishes he could go back to, because that's when he felt real love, as opposed to maybe the cause of him being unable to recognize real love. And there's this another scene that just fucking destroys me every time too, is when he gets this client who has I think it's either AIDS or
Oh my God.
Kaposi's sarcoma, I think it's called. That it might be is some sort of skin disease, cancer thing that's caused by AIDS, and the guy just wants to be touched and not like
Yeah.
have sex with him, and that bothers him. That because it was just about intimacy and connection as opposed to just sex.
Certainly.
And boy, what a powerful scene that is too.
It really.
And that's the way that it's staged is that, it's staged much more menacingly than any of the other ones, even though
That's
even
interesting.
though it and like part of it I think
Mm-hmm.
is, maybe to like play with like audience expectations, but like what you're saying right now makes me think that there's something else going on in terms of Neil's POV, in that, he's finding this very frightening and this very kind of filled with menace because it's about emotional, intimacy, as opposed to like a strictly um or like is like a form of physical intimacy that isn't entirely like associated with sex entirely, which is more associated with being close and, personally intimate with someone. No, that's interesting. I hadn't thought
See,
about
this is
that.
why we talk about movies, because I always, that was a scene, even though I've seen this a lot, that's a scene that I've always sort of been like, why are they staging this like a horror scene? Like I'm gonna be like, me, the audience is disgusted by this man who clearly is like in a tough place and has a disease. Like I
Mm,
don't think of him like that.
right.
But that is exactly what's going on. It is not the disease is like a red herring or something. It's just yeah, it's incidental as far as Neil is concerned. What the problem is the fact that he's going to have to hug this guy,
Yeah.
right, and be tender. That's interesting.
Mm,
Yeah, and maybe just so much of the stuff with his character is just so raw and emotional and handled with such complexity and candor there, that maybe just the tonal shift so often going back to the other guy in
mhm.
a story that's presented more kind of quirkier and almost fantastical, or even humorous in parts. It's just like maybe I would appreciate them both more separately
Mm,
than in the same film. Uh, but of course, they do eventually end up together in the final scene, which is another way to just make sure that the the movie ends with me completely
Oof.
yeah.
devastated, where he describes the truth to him, and specifically how it's set, where they go
Mm,
into the actual house, but it's been taken over by a new family, so
mm,
everything is different, and there's Christmas decorations up, which is such a good representation of how you would look back at your own past. You can always imagine going into your childhood home and but seeing somebody else's belongings in there. And yeah, things do definitely come together
mm.
during that section.
The moment when they get the knock on the door, and like you think that initially that's like, oh fuck, the like family who's living there has come home and it's going to be this other thing, and it ends up just being carolers, and that ends up kind of seeing them through to this next moment. I don't know, that for some reason that like really gets me
Oh,
along with it.
It's beautiful, yeah.
Did either of you find the ending optimistic? I'm curious.
where he talks about how something about he wants to disappear and be the angels in the night, but he can't.
Mm.
Which
Yeah,
I guess a
those
lot of
very
it.
last lines, I did find a little underwhelming.
Mm.
Like, because I didn't think
Oh,
that
come
that was
on!
where.
Interesting.
I'm gonna come over there and tickle you one of these days.
And maybe that's another thing, that whole last scene, I mean, it's about this major catharsis and realization for Brian.
Mm.
And Neil is there to help it, but Brian's journey is so different from Neil's that his catharsis isn't really the same thing, isn't the same catharsis for Neil. So I didn't necessarily see how he got to a place where he talked about wanting to run away to get away from things to end on. Like, that was just another thing that made their two arcs seem not complementary, or like they weren't ending up affecting each other in the same way. And I'm just talking about the very last shot that's, going away, and him doing that little speech. That just kind of drove home for me of just how their characters weren't necessarily important to each other, outside of Neil just happening to be the one who could tell the truth to Brian.
Interesting. So, sorry.
But you can only imagine where, obviously, Brian has the truth now. So that is something that's, obviously, we don't know where he's going to go from there, what he's going to do with that, but he is out of the dark now. And I think that there's an optimism to that there was no chance of him going anywhere or growing or being able to perhaps deal with it and open up, in his own life. And now there is. So, but I mean, yeah, sorry,
no worries.
that's what I would find optimistic about it.
Interesting. So I think that like by him telling him and like talking to someone else who was there and going through, I think that that's actually like where things may have like changed, or like had like the catharsis for Neil of allowing kind of this like emotional vulnerability to occur with someone who's also experienced that. And I guess what I was thinking about in terms of it being like an optimistic ending or something is like, it's less about sort of what happens in that moment, but what, like you were saying, like what goes on afterwards, essentially, of like, I think the fact that these two people being emotionally intimate and being able to like share this this experience that they had shared together, that no one else that they knew had any experiences like that as far as they could tell, or to have like any of this to share with. I don't know. I feel like that there is something happening to both of them there, and that they're, it hints towards how they can kind of proceed and like move on and like kind of close the door partially on one thing, and still have like the lingering effects, but maybe have some ideas of like how to proceed from there.
Yeah, there's a witness for both of them with accountability, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
There's a chance for that, where both of them have kind of attempted in one way or another to sculpt the narrative, and like, because no one else is combating it. So in the privacy of their own minds, they can make it whatever they want, that sometimes isn't the actual truth. And I think ideally they go forward. I don't know how much I really care to like kind of get specific about like what I think will happen after this. I think the end of any like piece of art is the end, right? But yeah, I think it's like the rest of the movie. It's bitter and sweet for sure. It is. yeah, like this pain will go on, but there's something else here. There's a chance. There's a chance, I guess, is what it is. I don't know if it'll really help in the end. Maybe they'll try to help each other, and it like their views on the subject will just make it toxic or whatever it is. But yeah.
And I think that like Neil, in a way, by explaining it, what happened to Brian, is in a way his like that's the first time he's kind of maybe recognizing it as abuse too. Again, as he's been like looking at it as something else, and by being with someone who was genuinely who like they were both hurt, but like who is more immediately identifiable as someone who was like harmed by that, who Neil played a part in that harming as well. That's part of his kind of like recognizing, like understanding. I think that he gets a new insight into what happened that he may have been aware of, but been like ignoring to an extent.
Okay,
maybe.
I like that reading. I think that, yeah, if you look at that as him realizing that it was something that hurt at least somebody else, that that does bring the two threads together more.
Right.
So
Maybe
like
he can
that.
help that other person, even if he's not interested in changing his mind about his own aspects or helping himself. Right.
Right.
Which is what this person kind of needs, I think, is someone else, like rather than because left alone, he's kind of self-destructive in a way.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just make that my final thoughts on this is that even if there are things maybe just kind of rhythmically with the editing sometimes that I found to be a little bit wobbly, that I mean, in the end, I can only like cry so many times during a movie before I just have to admit that this just like deeply has affected me. And I do think this is a kind of, this movie does feel in a way, daring and transgressive in a way that early Gregg Araki movies felt like, but with this newfound emotional directness that I think is really special. And I cannot say enough about how good Joseph Gordon-Levitt is in this. And just young and beautiful and beatific, and but he so inhabits this character, and all of the seems to so deeply understand exactly why he acts the way he does, and reminds me of people that I knew like while first coming out around that age, and the kind of inability to help them, and recognizing how vulnerable that they are, and set up for something bad to happen, and but also being a very attractive, appealing person, and seeing how other people could take advantage of them. It's just, there's so much real stuff there. And also special shout out for clearly like a very ethical way of filming with child actors in this movie, with I think you mentioned a lot of direct to camera shots and stuff. You can always tell how this whole thing could have been filmed without the kid actors knowing anything that was going on. So, which is something maybe Larry Clark could learn from.
I mean, it is amazing to compare the two like sense of sexuality, where one is showing things that are even like way more intense and way more taboo, in such like rather simple editing techniques and camera setups, like remedying any sort of argument against them, or seeing like any argument that would say that they are like sexualizing the children or whatever it is. Like, yeah, it's kind of wild.
Right.
I mean, it's still touchy territory, because these kids are going to grow up and then realize what kind of movie they were in, and maybe they're not going to be okay with that. But
it always is. Yeah. Of course.
But compared to something like I had to think about Happiness a couple times while we were watching this, because it's another movie that tackles kind of similar subject matter in a way that is so frank and completely merciless that it still feels shocking, and it's a totally different approach. But I do think the most empathetic part of Happiness is towards the pedophile character, which doesn't excuse or apologize for his behavior at all. And this is kind of a flip side to that, but this is like the humanistic view of how you could approach that tricky stuff in a bold way without being super cynical about it like Todd Solondz is. But so yeah, for the most part, this is a very special and powerful movie.
Absolutely.
And so what about you, BR? Is there anything else that we didn't get to with that, or you want to throw in as a final thought?
Oh my goodness. Shout out to I know that he uses like all of his soundtracks are like half slow dive songs, but like shout out to using Dagger in particular in that thing.
Oh, the music is so great.
The music's so good.
Yeah,
that's such a big
that
part.
Sid Barrett cover.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. Just some good lines. Your face looked like you'd been erased. That's a good line.
Whoa.
Hate it when they look like Tarzan, sound like Jane. Just good line. Just there's just really, you can tell that was based off of a book. I haven't read the book. I'd like to read it though. But
it's great.
Yeah, just a great movie. I tend to skew more towards like favoring Araki's goofier stuff just because I have like a lot of connections to it and they're a lot more fun. But this movie's so incredible. I love it. It's a beautiful movie.
Yeah.
So Seth, are you gonna unwatch it? That's the vibe I'm getting.
Yeah, that's that. No, I do still think it's one of my favorite movies. It really did impact me when I saw it. I mean, partially, I saw like my friend showed me like clips of it when we were hanging out. I guess it was a date or something, and I mean that sort of charged it also with this sort of nostalgic feeling. I saw it and then finally actually saw the whole movie later. But like sort of we watched like different clips from it, like the more like teenage, like just basically he was showing me like, isn't Joseph Gordon-Levitt like handsome in this movie, right? But I did get the like shoegazy romance of it and everything, and I think it's amazing that the romantic like growing up youthful like journey still holds together and still like is there even in the context of such huge like issues going on. It somehow doesn't become an issue movie like or like a PSA about child abuse. It just seems like an impossible endeavor to like pull off. And I guess I was going to I was going to kind of ask, I don't know what light you can share about it, like maybe your process, BR, but like your like just the idea of like Gregg Araki going into something about child abuse. Is this you're I don't know, that's like heavy, and it's like I couldn't imagine going in. There's like one thing about like we're going to shed light on something and that should happen, like artists should do that, should shed light on like touchy subjects or like difficult subjects, but it's another thing to be the person who does that. And I can't imagine as an artist, like I would just constantly be worried, like I'm still not doing it right, I'm still like bothering someone or letting someone down who has been traumatized or whatever. And like you do it in a little bit more of an artifice way, I guess, like a there's a supernatural like suicide epidemic in your book, Negative Space. But I can only imagine that was like a bit of a concern for you, like not wanting to do it in this, like wanting to approach something so intense in a responsible way, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, I think
it must have been difficult.
I think I am like, it's easier for me just because it's writing. I'm not involving anyone else. It's all just me. I think I would feel a lot more nervous if I was bringing other people in who were also going to be seen as like representing a certain experience. But I don't know. I don't necessarily. I try not to think too much about necessarily like responsibility or like having a message or anything like that. It's more about just trying to convey experiences and a ultimate vision as honestly as possible, like, which is like kind of a cliche answer, but and not to say that I'm entirely successful, like, those thoughts creep in and things like that, but I try not to have mm, I try to have it sort of be as subliminal as possible, or like as, not intentional as possible. I try to like push away sort of any conscious intention and like let the thing be the thing. At least in terms of like dealing with like those difficult topics and things like that. I'm not sure if that makes sense.
No, it does.
Well, yeah, I
No,
think that's really
absolutely.
all that you can do, because you can't
Mm-hmm.
be everything to everyone and represent every experience, and
Right.
so
Yeah,
all you
that's a
can do
mistake to
is
think like that. Yeah.
exactly. So all you can really do is, if you're being a place that seems truthful to you, that's not being overly whatever
Hmm. Yeah, it's
cynical or
mhm.
something disingenuous. I think you probably have an inner voice that tells you, at least, this is why I'm approaching it this way.
Right. It's like I think that's you bring up a good point. Like, it's I always try to be. It's more about like it's not so much like how do I represent this in a responsible way, but how do I do justice to it? And whether that's a feeling or an event, because with fiction or art in general, um, going back to Bully a little bit, like the one-to-one, like pulling quotes directly from the book, that might be the facts, but it doesn't necessarily capture the truth of it. So it's like, even if I'm like working in something that's like more speculative or supernatural or something, the the core kind of like roots of those things are like, for the most part, like based in like real things and like real experiences and like feelings or things like that. So it's all about trying to do justice to it, as opposed to like trying to do a one for one model, or how do I convey something in like a way that's like most responsible or something like that, if that makes sense.
That totally does. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of writing, then I want to make sure that everybody is aware that you can get Burn You the Fuck Alive
Woo!
anywhere now. I read a couple
Yeah.
really glowing reviews of it, and this is short stories, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's about 10 more traditional short stories, and then another 10 more flash and experimental pieces. Um,
So that might be maybe a good, maybe a less intimidating entry point if you're curious about BR's work, and gearing up for something like one of his longer novels. This could be a way to kind of dip your toe in, check out a few of these stories. And I saw it's on Amazon. You can get it pretty much anywhere, right?
yeah, absolutely. I think it's on Amazon Bookshop. Um, yeah, all available.
Cool. Is there anything else that you want to bring people's attention towards?
So I was, this is probably appropriate for this. I was involved in a couple of movies that could be considered unwatchable by those, the way that you guys have set it up.
All right.
The first one, I co-wrote a film with my director friend Nick Verdi, Caucasoid, which the only way to see either of these movies is to DM us with links. So hit me up on Instagram or my Gmail, and
Okay.
we'll hook them up. And the most recent one, it's actually playing at Philadelphia Unnamed Film Festival this coming Friday. This will probably be uploading after that, but it's Sweet Relief, which I didn't write, but I play a very, very terrible man in it.
Sick.
Yeah, and again, hit me up for a screener link. But and both of those are directed by Nick Verdi.
All right.
Sick.
That is
I'm gonna
so
do it.
hardcore to be like, man, you just message him, man, and he will get a link to the movie.
We keep on
We've never had that offer before.
The future of distribution for indie film. I was just on another podcast and was just talking about there isn't really a cinema equivalent of print on demand or like Bandcamp or something like that, because YouTube isn't really seen as like a thing for content. There isn't really like an app where people can just kind of like upload their independent, no budget features, and it's like available on your TV, your Roku or PS4 or TV or whatever. So there's kind of like a dearth of that, and like there being like a proper platform. So in the meantime, it really comes down to us like sending out Google Drive links or whatever.
All right.
So that's how we're doing it now.
That's the new way.
Yeah.
Revolution.
Maybe that'll be a future episode then, the unwatchable films of B.R. Yeager. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Unreadables. I swear I'm going to make it Unreadables one of these days. You'll definitely be on there.
Well, thank you so much. I was like, appreciated the ability to return to both of these films. It's been a while.
Absolutely. It's like I'm a child again.
Yep.
What a good way to put it.
Those fond teenage years. These movies really take me back. Unwatchables is produced by Tony Scarpitti, hosted by me, Marc Dottavio, and Seth Troyer, with artwork by Micah Kraus. You can find Seth and I on Letterboxd under Marc Dottavio and Sloth Troyer. You can also check us out at unwatchablespod.com for links to our Twitter and Instagram, or support us on Patreon for bonus content and to have a say in what we watch. Thanks for listening.